I'm excited to kind of dive into some of these articles. It just keeps getting better. So with WeWork, I thought we'd kind of jump into this particular article I read recently related to how they're handling kind of the bankruptcy process. So for those of you guys who have not followed along, they've been in bankruptcy proceedings for the last 6 months or so, and they're trying to work through, their post-bankruptcy financials and everything like that. Essentially, what they're describing is that there's, as part of the post-bankruptcy plan, they're going to be closing. I think they're going to be exiting 337 locations, including 178 offices across 38 cities, which will essentially be a reduction to that point. So the total count, I think, that their 2019 peak was 850 office buildings. So, you're talking about a sizable decrease in their footprint. But as part of this transition, hopefully what they're trying to do is to get to profitability come next year. So they talked about how WeWork will hit profitability next year and hopefully clear a net income of $101 million, which is pretty surprising considering, all the debauchery that's been happening over the last couple of years. But it looks like they still have a pretty strong membership count. I think they're looking at 300,000 members are still active on the WeWork platform, down from about 700,000 back in their peak in 2022. And they're slowly starting to try to continue to get back to normal and start growing. Now, one thing that I did find interesting, which I know we've talked about in several different articles, is that Adam Newman, the previous CEO of WeWork, is actively trying to buy back WeWork. And so they've been, they talked a little bit about how a non-disclosure agreement was delivered to WeWork in attempts to try to gather the financial information that they're going to need to make the final offer, and that was unacceptable. So there's a lot of back and forth going on there. They also have some issues with SoftBank and some of the other investors where there's some butting of heads about what plan of attack should take place. And then obviously all these creditors are involved trying to grab what they can. They're trying to grab what they can regarding, what's left after the bankruptcy that will be available to be collected. And WeWork slow playing it, and they're trying to essentially starve out the creditors so that they can benefit from maybe accepting a much lower amount than they previously would have. So it's still an ongoing thing, and it seems like it's not going to be a quick solution. So
I mean, what I've experienced with WeWork, which by the way, you can go into my article as well, like right afterwards. I actually put up a very similar one, but it was more specifically talking about how I guess they're at this point now where they need $400 million or thereabouts of funds raised from any type of investor. I think they reached out to like 30 different investors, like big institutions, to raise another 400 million to kind of clear house of all the expenditures that they are still required or they're still being targeted to pay, essentially, from all these different creditors. Very interested to see how this kind of pans out for our WeWork people here. I've actually spent time at a WeWork. I think they really do have some nice locations. I think there's just a lot of competition out there today. I'm actually blown away. I don't know if you're blown away or the people who are watching this. Are you guys blown away with how many freaking members they still have? 300,000 members still are paying monthly, which is kind of impressive. I mean, I'm shocked that they actually dropped from 700,000 to 300,000 as fast as they did. I would have never guessed they had that many members, and curious why.
I think they dropped off. They sold off some of their businesses internationally. So they talked about in that article how they had sold their interests in India, and I think they had sold some interest in other countries as well. So that's probably part of it, that big drop off. And again, this is a 2-year period because they were at their peak, I guess, of 700,000 members in 22, and they obviously are now closer to 300,000. So I think part of that too is just selling off, interests in different areas.
Well, if you do some math, right? I mean, just basic math here. If we do, like an average person's probably paying like $300 times 300,000 members. I mean, that's only $90 million a year. I don't know how they plan on netting $101 million. I guess they're netting substantially more than $300 an average member.
I think it's more expensive than that, especially in larger cities. And depending on whether or not you have like a private office versus just like a desk, like there's different tiers. So I'm sure some members a ton.
You'd have to be, but I'm saying even at 1,000, right? You do 1,000 times 300,000 members. That's $300 million in gross income. And I don't know. I'm very curious to see how they really plan on, making them some credit profit. I don't think WeWork's going to be like, look, Regis. I don't know how Regis is even at where it's at right now. I'm kind of shocked. But at least they've done it. I think they just have grown through profitability instead of growing for growing's sake, unlike WeWork. So I'm very curious to see how things transcend with everything here. I mean, like again, a similar article, but this just shows that they're, towards the ending of towards the end of chapter 11 here, and is saying how they need $400 million worth of money raised, like we were mentioning, and how Adam Newman has sent over a conditional offer of about $600 million for the entire business, which who knows. But look, if you look at drain cash reserves, if you scroll down a second, it shows here that WeWork seeks to raise new funding of the money. The company's cash balance has declined to $89.6 million at the end of February from the $113 million at the start of the month, as operating expenses in February alone were more than the revenue generated, right? Similar to like I was even mentioning. So I'm very curious to really understand how they really plan on becoming somewhat profitable here. So very, very curious.
Yeah, yeah, and it may. I mean, obviously, this is what they propose is a best case scenario to where they become profitable come next year. But there's still a lot of parties at play that are having to accept this plan. It may very well be that this doesn't get resolved anytime soon, and who knows if they end up actually getting to the point where they become profitable by next year. It's an interesting business model. But I think going forward, obviously, having flexibility in office space is kind of the way of the future. So, I do think they're going to be okay. It remains to be seen how that's really going to play out in the coming years. So,
I guess we will see. But in my opinion, I think it's going to be a long road ahead of them to actually break to profitability. I actually did this article, so obviously, Chad is not with us today, but I thought this would be an interesting article to get his take on, because this is obviously for a location specifically in Canada. But for those who are in the U.S. or internationally, I'm very curious to get your thoughts on this. And Chad will be back next week. He's just traveling. But this is just talking about how Canada has a couple of these situations. We have gigantic underground retail centers, essentially huge retail complexes underground near the path, which is, I guess, a collection of retail stores underneath 75 buildings, with almost as many landlords brought together by the city as by the city that puts the bill to connect them. So it's just interesting how there's so much opportunity where if you can think slightly differently, like imagine this is specifically for a type of area where you have a lot of like subway systems, where imagine, places like New York, where you could have so much retail down below underground, where you're basically, creating the ability for maybe more affordable retail, but also in locations where you already have a ton of people who are passing by all day long every day. So I'm just curious. I thought it was incredibly fascinating. I was like, I don't know how well this would work in certain areas, but in other areas, I think it could be a really interesting thing to start adding as a trend.
Obviously, in these larger cities where you have some of the infrastructure already created, especially you reference the subway system. If you guys have ever had a chance to go to like Japan or some of these other larger metro areas, they're almost like mini cities in these metro systems. So there's this really famous Michelin star sushi restaurant that's located in a subway in Tokyo, and there's like a year and change wait, and it's a little nook restaurant that has like, I don't know how many seats it has, but let's call it 10, 15 seats, like very tiny. And it's like one of the best sushi restaurants in the world. It's a Michelin star restaurant, and it's just kind of located in the subway in Tokyo. So it's
amazing.
like it's kind of fascinating. But you're right. I mean, there's obviously certain value to having subterranean. Now, I don't know the cost of boring and creating the infrastructure to be able to support something subterranean. I'm sure that can be quite expensive, but there's got to be reasoning behind doing it that way versus others. I know, in other articles that we've seen, we've talked about like the industrial product now starting to become multi-story. So, it's back in the day, it didn't make any sense to do that because the cost to do it, and maybe the technology wasn't quite there yet. But now that the cost of being able to do that has dropped, and the demand for space in those condensed areas is so high, then maybe at that point it makes sense to start exploring different options, and subterranean retail makes sense.
Yeah, I just thought it was incredibly fascinating, especially with the architecture of having to put that all together with the structural systems, and found it quite interesting. Where I was wondering where in the U.S. we've actually seen this. I'm very curious. I was, very, very, very curious to see where. I'm actually going to Google this. Where is there subterranean?
Like malls or something.
Retail.
Yeah.
In Virginia, there's a residential complex.
Oh, Penn Station. Penn Station in New York. So Tom said Penn Station in New York. That could be it. Yeah.
There's Crystal City, Virginia, which has an entire, next to the national airport there, which has an extensive underground city connecting its hotels, office buildings, apartment towers, and is lined with 173 shops. Yeah,
Yeah,
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I used to live in DC. They expanded before I left, or after I left, they expanded the railway from Virginia all the way out to, well, I think there was an end of the blue line, and it went all the way out to or the silver line, I think. Goes all the way out to the IED, which is the major airport in Virginia now, which is great. So I think maybe they did something there. I don't know.
Definitely interesting take when you start, especially building mega high rises or in those top tier cities that have that already. So very interesting there.
Absolutely. All right. So next up is apartment starts fall 43% from 2023. So kind of reiterating a lot of the things that we've been seeing in other articles that we've been following. It looks like, U.S. multifamily developments of more than 5 units have dropped 43.7% compared to the same month in 2023. Obviously this is a big decrease, but it's kind of something that we saw coming just through higher interest rates, higher construction costs, et cetera. So as far as a comparison goes, the starts for the annualized rate for starts in March of 2024 was roughly 290,000 units compared to 515,000 units during the same month earlier in 2023. Leading indicator of development, which dropped 17.5%. Compared to the previous year. Apparently, multifamily home starts though did go up annually, but were down 12.4% from February. Not sure why there was such a disparity between back in March of 2023 versus 2024, but that's just a stat that's out there. They kind of talked a little bit about obviously the reasons why this could potentially be happening, but the fact that shelter inflation, which includes apartment rents, mortgage costs, and et cetera, rose 5.7% in March from the year prior. So you're still seeing an uptick in the cost of housing, as inflations begin to stabilize. If inflation for the cost for housing continues to rise, at that point, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more developers that want to take the risk of saying, okay, well, let's jump into developing more product, especially as the new product starts coming online and gets filled out. It'll just be, more developers will be open to starting these projects. So I wanted to kind of get your take on it.
Yeah, I think like once we see interest rates start to cool off, once we start seeing, inflation rates start to cool off, I think that this is going to spike again drastically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for right now, I think it makes sense. I mean, everything's insanely expensive, and a lot of these developers keep thinking that they're going to be getting pre-low rents, right? Like really think that they're going to be pushing rents higher and higher and higher, like here in downtown Miami. I think that we're actually seeing a cool off in rents. Like I really do believe that, because people are not going to be paying 5, 6, 7, 8,000 a month in rent, or an average individual is not going to be doing that, right? And these developers keep thinking that they can continue to push rents to be higher and higher and higher every year. It's just not reality. Like we were talking about, where the luxury apartments have been cooling off, but a lot of the B, C class product has been doing very, very well. In a number of apartment buildings and in New Jersey, and we've been seeing pretty much stagnant rents. It's not like every year we're going to see drastic increases, and we're just try to be hopeful and try to get somewhere between 3.5% and 7.5% increases a year. Like if we see that, hypothetically, like in some of our buildings, rental restricted areas where we can only increase so much, like if we have a $2,500 a month apartment, we can increase by 3.5%. Nearly $100. In other markets, we'll try to get 150, 125, 175, maybe 100, depending on where we're sitting here. Just try to keep it affordable for tenancy, because it's obviously infinitely more expensive to try to get to a new tenant and having those months vacated or not getting rent. So just definitely very interesting, the dynamic. Like during the 2020, 2021, 2022, every year you can increase by 10, 20, 30%, and you were getting it. But here it's just you have to be mindful.
Absolutely. And these developers, when you take on these projects, I mean, in most municipalities, it's going to take you 2 years to get the project completed, especially if you're taking on a pretty large project like a 200 unit or 300 unit apartment project. Once you get through entitlements and you get through site work and you get through the construction process and get open and starting to lease, I mean, you could very well be 18 to 24 months into the process, and so you almost have
no one knows where everything is there.
That's what I'm saying. You have to kind of look at your crystal ball and say, what's 18 to 24 months going to look like? And right now everyone's like, I have no idea. So the likelihood of them wanting to take a $20 million risk or $30 million risk is a lot lower. So I think that's a big piece of it too, is that even though shelter costs are continuing to rise, they can't definitively say, oh yeah, we're going to be in a better position to 18 months from now than we were expecting. So
I'm very curious to get people's opinions. Like, do you think that interest rates are going to be higher or substantially? Do you believe that rents in 2 to 3 years are going to be higher than they are today? If so, make your predictions. And I'd love to kind of look back over the years. I'm very curious to see, what people think. But anyways, next article here, Las Vegas to California high-speed rail, which we've talked about in the past, is finally underway. Very interesting, right? Like, this is cool. I was just actually in Las Vegas speaking at an event, and a lot of people were coming out from California. And I have family in California. I have family in Vegas. That trip is very, very, very common. And I'm very curious to, see how this progresses. This is going to be a fantastic addition to transportation options when you're obviously traveling from one to the other. And on top of that, this is a fantastic thing to be paying attention to as investors into these types of projects that are going on. And then buying apartments along the rail line where people are going to want to have the ability to just go straight from LA to Vegas, or from, it says even here, Miami to Orlando. Brightline is actually, they just opened up. They have the Brightline right by me, literally less than 15 minutes from my house. I can jump on a Brightline and go from downtown Miami and Brickell all the way up to Orlando. It's, super convenient. And I like these railways that I feel like have been underutilized in the sense of, not looking at it as commuter so much. This is a great opportunity for people to be paying attention to where buying, could be infinitely better for them long-term with these rentals.
Have you taken the Brightline yet? Or how does the cost and timing compare to, for example, flying?
The Brightline, you can literally buy the day of. You could jump on a train, and it's going to take you, 2.5 hours, 3 hours to get to Orlando. Now, to fly there, you probably have the 1.5, 2 hour whole ordeal on the front end of flying. Then you have the 25, 30-minute ordeal on the back end, plus the hour or so, 40. It's really like a 35-minute flight, but they take a long or whatever. But overall, it's still like 4-ish hours. But I also think that cost-wise, actually, let me see what it is right now. Because right now, the Brightline, you could probably get it done from here to Orlando for like $100. Or maybe cheaper if you post it in the first class coach area. Miami to Orlando.
Obviously I go back to Europe relatively often, and I love traveling by train. I feel like it's much more comfortable. Like you said, you can hop on, hop off. I'm assuming they're pretty strategic about where they're placing these stations so that you could potentially just come right into close to downtown Orlando or whatever. And so, there could very well be a lot of value there. So I'm all about it. I think
by the way, are $53 to $127 per person. So not super expensive, but it's almost the same for the train.
And it's more convenient, like you said. You go to the train station, you wait for the train, you hop on the train. It's much more comfortable than a plane ride in most cases, because planes, unless you get the extended, leg room, or you get first class or business class, you're obviously going to be more comfortable. But if you're just in coach,
apparently you can do Spirit for $20.
I hate Spirit.
One way though.
I can't.
Want a full chair? You can get there for $20.
That's good to know. I've been delayed on Spirit enough times to where now I'm like never gonna fly them again. So I'm usually
it also doesn't include everything. So by the time you have your bag and everything else paid for, it's already $200.
Oh yeah. That's how they get you. They say, oh yeah, you can't have a carry on. Oh, you can't do this, or you can't do that. And by the end of it, it's just like, okay, well, it didn't.
Might as well just pay for first class with United.
Exactly. But no, I think it's a great idea. I really do. I'm very bullish on trying to create more public transportation systems, including, train being one of the best options, just because, again, it's somewhat economical, very convenient. You eliminate having to have buses and cars, which, we've talked about, pollution and everything. Obviously having a train option, in particular, if you can get one that's based on magnet technology or other things like that, you can definitely make it work better. So next up is medical outpatient buildings are a good segment for CRE. This particular article talked about the viability and the demand for medical office as a segment for investment, and just a demand for business owners as a whole. So as we're all aware, the baby boomer generation is accelerating into retirement at a rapid pace. They comprise that based on the cost of age groups, how much they spend. If you're over 65, which is, again, an increasing number of baby boomers, you make up about 36% of all healthcare spending. And if you add 55 to 64 as a demographic, that number jumps to 55% of all healthcare spending in the United States. So, a good percentage of our population fall into that category. And with that comes higher demand for healthcare services. Outpatient in particular has become one of a much more attractive option, is because if you were to get a similar service in a hospital setting versus an outpatient setting, oftentimes it's a lot more affordable. You start getting, more urgent cares popping up and some other outpatient service providers that can provide those services for the general populace. And so what they said is that in the next 5 years, outpatient is projected to increase over the same period by 10%. So compared to hospital or inpatient opportunities. Another thing that they mentioned here, which was kind of interesting, is they highlighted the different types of outpatient services that are going to really be booming. Endocrinology was one that they said was one of the fastest growing because of the prevalence of diabetes and new therapies to kind of combat that. Cancer centers are also a big piece. And I guess the way that they utilize space has changed significantly. So One Medical, the primary care provider owned by Amazon, roughly 60% of the space that they occupy is more in retail properties. 36% is more traditional medical office. And then 5% is in medical first floor for multifamily buildings. So as you can imagine, back in the day, many of the way that the space was utilized by medical practices was much more traditional. Whereas nowadays, in particular, with more outpatient type of services, you're going to see them a lot more in retail centers, and you're going to see them in freestanding buildings, et cetera. So I guess this is just more information about, the numbers of absorptions and really, kind of highly explaining more the nuances of that property type. So I thought it was a pretty good article.
When you're looking at office buildings, a lot of office buildings right now can still be incredibly viable options when they have the right tenancy, right? Like if you have a medical office building in, the 90+% of the occupancy of the building is medical office with a very, very strong tenancy, you're going to see the valuation of that office building could be substantially higher, and you might be able to be buying it for a great price, right? You might be able to buy it for, in my market, a great Class A building might have traded for over $200 a square foot, $200-$300 a square foot, and maybe today you could buy that same building for $100 or $125 a foot at 50% off, technically of previous values. But if you have, fantastic tenancy and you could buy at a 9.5 or 10 cap at a great price per square foot, give me a very viable option for you. And a lot of people are missing that as a possibility for great investment options. Look, medical office is a very strong asset class. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's here to stay. I think you can get medical tenants in any type of property that you have, whether it's mixed use or or retail or office or any of the mix. It's a fantastic option for increasing the value of your building over time because people prefer to have those types of tenants, and they most of the time make great money and they stay longer.
And the build out cost. I mean, I talk to financial professionals all the time, and we actually have a gentleman here who mentioned that he works in finance in the healthcare space and agreed that more outpatient facilities are in the future, and they're already planning and investing around it. So I know from my own perspective and talking to lenders, the default rate for, medical practices is super low. So the risk, the lenders love it. Investors love it because the build out costs are significant for these medical practices. So typically they're going to sign long-term leases and don't want to go anywhere. Once you've established yourself in that market, you kind of want to stick around, especially because of the level of investment you're going to be making in these facilities. And so it's kind of a win-win-win for all involved. So next up is rates take a turn for the worse in an already weak housing market.
Just to kind of talk about, obviously, for those of you who are not paying attention to where interest rates are hovering these days, the 10-year treasury, let me bring up the treasury rates, actually. This will be very interesting for us. CNN, I'm not a big fan of CNN, but I'll look up the treasury rates. 4.662 for the 5-year. So obviously we're looking at rates somewhere in the mid to low sevens at the most conservative rates, where single family housing is typically at the mid to sevens, if not 8+, with prime sitting at, I think, 8.5 right now, which is kind of insane to think about. Again, seeing these types of historical pricing and numbers here, where you can see December 31st of 2021, mortgage rates were 3.3%, in which things have been going, and everyone had the expectation that things would be much would have been cooled off by now, and rates would be trending in the right direction. And we're just not exactly seeing that. I think we're almost at basically near the highest highs that we've seen in the last few years. But again, look, if you look at over historical rates, I still think we're in a pretty decent position overall. And the big thing here is the mortgage applications you can see are trending in the wrong direction, obviously, but they're going to, this is what happens, especially with a lot of uncertainty, and with interest rates kind of moving in the wrong direction. You're going to see mortgage rates starting to come down. But I think with optimism coming in, which look, I think it's a big dependent on a few things. Number one, time of year. Time of year right now, spring into summer. Like there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be starting to move. So I think that will start to tick up a little bit. Obviously, we're not ticking up overall, by the way. It's relative when you look at it from the fact of like when mortgage rates were freaking 2%, of course, they'll be substantially higher. I mean, that's just a logical thing. I think it's also important to be paying attention to the fact that this is a perfect opportunity where if you're a residential agent and you're listening to our content, you can be a dynamic agent and be paying attention to commercial trends and be paying attention to the fact that like, hey, maybe starting to sell commercial real estate could be a possibility where you can supplement your residential business with commercial transactions where, again, let's say last year you made $100,000 or 2 years ago you made 200 grand, then 150, and you're looking to, because obviously, maybe you're on the downward trend, which a lot of people may have been because of interest rates and where things are going. And you're obviously like, hey, I want to make 150, 200, 300 grand or something like that this year. And you want to start ticking things up. Doing one transaction on the commercial side can easily add possibly another $100,000 to your bottom line. I think a lot of people are possibly missing out on that opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of commercial agents listening here today, but I think there's a lot of resi who are very much too focused on commercial business and they start adding a little bit of commercial to their world. And I think this is a good moment and a good reminder that maybe starting to spend a little bit of time on the commercial side will be able to support you in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't know if I'm sure you get calls all the time from residential agents that are looking to add commercial into their repertoire. And I know I talk to residential agents, probably a month, that reach out. Obviously, we're content creators, so we get reached out to a lot, I'm sure. But I feel like those conversations definitely have increased over the last, call it year, just with, the slowing pace of activity on the residential side. And, a lot of the people that I deal with, my wife's in residential real estate, and I obviously know a lot of mortgage lenders and everything else. And it seems like a lot of the conversations they end up having is to try to help their clients qualify for these properties. So obviously you still have elevated purchase price or interest, you have elevated values of property, and the average person is not making what they need to in order to qualify for these properties. So a lot of them don't even make it to the application process because they get eliminated right off the bat. They may send something to their mortgage lender and they say, well, it's probably not even worth us going down this path because it's just not going to be feasible for you to really go down it. So I'm sure some of those numbers are skewed because they just don't even go through the process to start. But, hopefully, it doesn't mean that people aren't out there looking for property. It's just, it's just tougher to make things work.
What I see here is that it's either, because like you have to think about it, these people are going somewhere. It's not like less people are moving. It's not like that's occurring, right? What's happening is that these people are just choosing another option, which a lot of the time is renting. So like a lot of people there's still a lot of moving going on, but a lot of it's just transferred into the world of renting, other different types of affordable housing options, right? People are getting into mobile homes. People are renting, and people are buying just less and less larger single family houses in a lot of specific areas. So I think it's just something to keep in mind. You need to become a dynamic agent in this type of day and age where you can't just keep relying on business the way that it's been done in the past.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right. So next up is the Kroger Albertson to divest Kroger and Albertson to divest more states. So if you guys haven't been following, last September, and this is something that has been evolving for several years, and there have been, denials of these mergers in the past. Obviously, Kroger's and Albertsons are one of the largest grocery store chains in the country, and they're trying to merge. And as part of the proposal to the FTC, they made a proposal saying we will divest from a certain amount of stores in order to not essentially create a monopoly. And so their initial proposal was rejected, and now they've come back to the table and says, okay, we will go ahead and divest from even more stores to try to just show their good faith to try to get this deal done. And so initially their initial plan was to sell off 413 stores to CS Wholesale Grocers. Now they've increased that number to 579 stores. They kind of talk a little bit about the different markets that they're focused on divesting from, or they talk to the CEO of Albertsons and Kroger, and they showcase that in order for them to remain competitive going forward, that this is the best way to be able to do so and provide great service and products to the community going forward and still maintain a strong workforce. The people on the other side of the aisle are saying that by this mega merger, it's going to cause costs to rise because obviously anytime that you have a merger like this, it creates a balloon effect where there's just less competition. And so obviously because of that, corporations have the right to be able to raise prices. And if that's the only option in town, that could obviously affect local residents. And so that's the concern of some of the pundits out there. And we'll see how this all evolves. It still may or may not go through, but it's always kind of interesting to see how some of these mergers play out, because oftentimes they don't go through because they just want to make sure that competition remains in the marketplace. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
I'm a big fan of this type of stuff, actually. Like I think that it's actually smart for there to have a little this built out this way. I think there's a lot of situations where this is actually very not only smart for the organizations that are involved, but also smart for the everyday average individual, because guess what? Now, like, they're going to be constantly trying to grow and expand in these specific markets. Plus, what I've also found is that sometimes these companies are not taking it super seriously. Like, I'm not saying Albertsons, like Kroger, I believe, is buying Albertsons, if I understand correctly.
I think it's a merger. So, I don't know how it's all structured, but
yeah, I don't know like who's acquiring who or whatever the way it's supposed to be. But I do see these as a positive thing. I do look this as, you start to see, standards increase. You start seeing the quality of certain things increase, right? Like when you start seeing companies that are not, like, there's a company called Food Town that is was a huge or a large local grocery store by me when I was growing up, right? And then you just see, and I remember going there when I was very young, and then you just see the standards of all of the stores start to ticker off. And it's like, these companies should be able to be acquired and put into larger corporations like this, and start to increase the quality of those types of locations, right? I mean, especially you don't want them to go because you need a grocery for that local market. But having these smaller, I mean, obviously, neither one of these are small, but having these types of situations occur, to me, I think is a good thing. I never understand why the heck the lawsuits ever happened here. Again, who was trying to stop it?
At the FTC. I mean, and they stopped other mergers in the past. I know Apple has tried to merge with some other companies. I don't know if it was Apple or it was maybe Microsoft. Like Microsoft tried to acquire or merge with another company a while back, and they put a stop to it.
I don't know. To me, I think it's silly. I think FTC should stop trying to prove why they need to be around and just let certain of these things happen. Like, it's different when Apple's trying, like, if hypothetically Apple and Microsoft are trying to buy each other or something like that. But like, I mean, like, what's funny? Because it's like, if you look at certain companies, like, okay, how many different companies, like large retailers, do you actually know about that sell things? Like, I mean, like, you have Amazon, you have Walmart, you got Target, and what else? Right? Like, that does like just about everything, right?
Meyer.
Where it's like, yeah, I would say that there's only so many big players, and they get taken up or beaten up and bought out, right? And it's just, I don't know. I never understand like what was the whole point, because it's like, if you look at Microsoft and Apple, what do they both have? Like, what percentage of the phone market do they own at this point, right? It's like, isn't Apple? Didn't they say Apple was like 80% of one of these markets already?
Oh yeah, but even now, like, to your point, Apple's getting sued right now because of their practices of eliminating competition, because again, they have such a big share of the personal cell phone market, and they're keeping out competitors through their business practices. So, I'm not
Apple
saying
has, as of March of 2024, Apple has 59% of the smartphone market.
Yeah, it's right? Nuts, man.
It is nuts. And like, if they add Samsung, which I guess Samsung is its own organization, I don't think they're owned by Microsoft.
No, it's a South Korean company, I think.
What is the FTC really going to do about it? You got Apple, who owns such a huge market share. You have, like, some of these growing. What are you really making these big issues for? I don't know. I don't see it.
It's a balance. It's a balance, and it's funny too, because obviously it's not only here in the U.S. but other parts of the country. We have an illusion of selection. So like if you look into a lot of the like Dasani, for example, is a water company, but it's owned by Coca-Cola. There's like 40 other different companies that Coca-Cola owns. And so you look at it and say, oh yeah, I'll look at all the selection, but in reality, the parent company always leads back to one of these large conglomerates. And so I'm not saying that it's good or bad or indifferent, but
I think
I will say this though.
No, I was gonna say, wouldn't it be smarter if they just said they can only make so much profit off of certain things?
Yeah,
like
but then
water.
You play with free market. I mean, it's always a balancing act. One of the things that I can comment on Kroger, for example, here in the Louisville market, they kind of had a monopoly where they were kind of the only show in town. They had like 80% or something market share, and now you're starting to see Publix, which is a Florida company actually, coming into the market, and they're being super aggressive. And then there's high Hy-Vee and there's other markets, because Louisville's a very good market for grocery, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of value in being in this market. And so what I envision happening is, because you have all these players come in the market, there's going to be a lot of competition. And, for the most part, competition is a very positive thing.
It's a great thing. I mean, everyone knows about the TikTok ban that has been proposed. I don't know if it's actually going to be passing. I doubt it. But I think this is interesting. Like, with the fact that they have this ban, which I guess they're incredibly confident that there's not going to be an issue. They just keep on signing new leases. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, because I'm curious, like, if TikTok all of a sudden gets a US ban, why would they? I mean, like, do you think they're gonna, they're obviously going to end up probably closing a lot of space considering the amount of traffic.
Well, I don't know if they're gonna. I think the what they're trying to argue is not to ban TikTok. It is to make sure that they are not owned by a Chinese entity. Whether that means that TikTok decides to sell its U.S. stake in the company to a company that's headquartered here and there's no real connection. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how that would all played out, but I think it's just based on the risk of having a offshore company that's controlled by a government that is obviously not favorable towards the United States, is what the concern is. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out.
I mean, look, I'm very curious to see how it all plays out as well. I think us these ideas of what we think is best. And to be honest with you, I mean, look, all of social media is very interesting these days. I mean, it's fascinating. Like, I mean, look, I like free speech. I like that we can all post whatever we want to post. I like the fact that, like, anyone has this this ability to share their story, share their ideas. And at the same time, I also find it incredibly fascinating. And because of that free speech, you have the ability, you have individuals who are pushing some insatiably bad things across these platforms, which again, it's scary, because a lot of you guys who might have kids, or your kids are being influenced, because think about how much time they're spending on this platform, right? I was doing a lot of research before I spoke about how much time people spend on average staring at their phones, right? Like staring on social media specifically. And it was something like 17 to 20 hours a week on average, a little over 2 hours a day spent staring at your phone on social media. And it's like, think about it, like this is becoming the next teacher, the next parent, sadly. I mean, this is just having just as much influence as parents, as schooling, as education is on your kids and then people around the world. So I just think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with depending on how things transition. I mean, imagine if Facebook ends up acquiring X percentage, which I doubt they would even let happen, but just would be very, very interesting to see where things transcend.
Yeah, I would assume with the size that TikTok is, it would just be like a spin-off. So it'd be the TikTok US, and then there'd be a Chinese entity that's separate.